Well, we have a national myth. We say that the reason we have segregation in every metropolitan area of this country is something we call de facto. This de facto notion that it all happened naturally, not by public design, is utter nonsense.
If you examine housing segregation in America, you begin to see a system of discrimination that impacts nearly every aspect of life, from the types of jobs you can access to where your children go to school and even how healthy you are. Residents in neighborhoods historically plagued by housing discrimination, like those in West and East Oakland, are more than twice as likely to go to the emergency room for asthma. They're also more likely to experience higher rates of poverty, crime, and infant mortality. So, what helped build the system of inequality? And what are its lasting impacts both in the Bay Area and throughout the country? To understand the impacts of housing segregation, we need to go back to its roots in federal policy. Meet Richard Rothstein, an expert on the history of segregation in America and author of the book The Color of Law.
So a white noose was created by the federal government around African-American neighborhoods everywhere in the country. This was an explicit design of the federal government. It was a constitutional violation.
In the 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression, the federal government wanted to encourage home ownership in cities that had suffered from waves of foreclosures.
A happy day it is for every family that can escape from the misery of a slum home and environment.
So it established the Homeowners Loan Corporation to refinance mortgages at risk of default. Neighborhoods were then color-coded on residential security maps. Green meant best or businessmen, blue meant still desirable with white-collar families, yellow meant a declining area with working-class families, and red meant hazardous or detrimental influences. This included foreign-born people, low-class whites, and people of color. In essence, the government wouldn't insure mortgages in areas it decided were too risky, and a major way that risk was calculated was by race. A black family moving in was seen as a threat to housing prices.
That's where the term redlining comes from. These maps in every metropolitan area of the country have districts that are colored red, indicating that African Americans and other undesirables, immigrants, other minorities, were living.
To redline a community was to mark it as undesirable and not worthy of investment. San Francisco and Oakland were two of the 239 cities mapped nationwide by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Here are maps of the cities created in 1937. As you can see, the neighborhoods marked in red on the maps make up the Western Addition, Chinatown, parts of the Mission, Bayview, as well as large areas of West and East Oakland. At the time, these neighborhoods were occupied by a largely non-white population.
The segregation that we created in the mid-20th century resulted in an enormous wealth gap between African Americans and whites, because most white families gained their wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes in appreciating neighborhoods.
So, while white families could invest in a home and build wealth, communities of color were effectively barred from this opportunity. Today, on average, Black Americans in the United States only have about 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. And even though the government officially banned redlining through the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the impacts of redlining and housing discrimination still persist. This is Carolina Reed, an expert in housing and community development.
We find that cities that had these redlining maps in place are still more segregated than cities that didn't. We find that neighborhoods that were redlined or that were denied access to credit have all sorts of lower outcomes, including lower health conditions, right? Sort of more health problems, higher rates of poverty, lower rates of educational attainment. And it is because these maps allowed the government to perpetuate this idea that certain neighborhoods shouldn't have access to credit and other neighborhoods should.
You see it in education too. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is through property taxes, and it creates a feedback loop. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, and more resources. Take a look at the Piedmont City and Oakland Unified School Districts. The districts border each other, but the Oakland district, located in an area that was historically redlined, receives less funding than Piedmont. In Oakland Unified, about $15,000 is spent per student, while in Piedmont, over $18,000 is spent on each student. Meanwhile, Piedmont ranks in the top 1% of schools in testing scores, while Oakland ranks in the bottom 50%. Redline neighborhoods are also disproportionately impacted by pollution and environmental hazards. Let's take a look at the Fruitvale neighborhood in Oakland.
If you think about the underlying logics that created redlining, they created lots of other conditions that led to government decisions to place hazardous activities in this neighborhood as opposed to in the wealthier and white neighborhoods. It was neighborhoods that, like Fruitvale, that were allowed to have industrial zoning right next to residential because those residential properties were worth less. It allowed for things like urban renewal or clearance of homes for freeway or BART construction because those properties were valued less and they were able to be called blighted.
Because of urban planning that benefited richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near dangerous industrial plants and in places with crumbling infrastructure. They're also more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food and in places where the water is unhealthy or undrinkable. And more subtle types of redlining and housing segregation continue, but in a different form. In 2008, the foreclosure crisis disproportionately impacted lower-income communities and communities of color, neighborhoods that were redlined decades before.
We saw a proliferation of loans with risky loan terms, such as exploding interest rates, no documentation loans, loans that had no down payment requirements, originated by banks and not caring at all whether or not a borrower who was taking on that mortgage had the ability to repay that mortgage. And as a result, in neighborhoods like Fruitvale, a lot of communities of color were targeted by predatory practices and predatory loans that then led them into foreclosure.
Of course, housing segregation is not unique to the Bay Area. Its impacts have played out in nearly every major American city. So, where does that leave us today? For starters, Richard Rothstein says we need much better and consistent enforcement of the Fair Housing Act.
So we really have two problems. One is the Fair Housing Act's explicit prohibition on discrimination is not well enforced. Realtors still steer African Americans and whites to different race neighborhoods. And the Fair Housing Act is not properly interpreted to ban policies which may be race neutral on their face, but that reinforce racial segregation. So we need to begin to confront the housing segregation issues that underlie so much of the discrimination that exists in the society today. But without the reckoning that we are now having, those kinds of new civil rights groups can't emerge. So I'm very hopeful that we're in a position to begin to redress these problems and begin to confront them, but we haven't yet.
For a more in-depth look at how housing discrimination continues to impact Bay Area neighborhoods, watch our 4-part documentary series, The Moms of Magnolia Street.